Opening the center's diagonal, d4 immediately asserts central space and prepares development. Instantly contesting the center and preparing development, this knight bravely occupies a vital square. Securing central space and preparing pawn advances to contest the d5 square. Embracing a fianchetto, black prepares to unleash a potent bishop and solidify their queenside pawn structure. Developing a knight to its natural outpost here solidifies the center and prepares to expand. Aggressively challenging the center, this pawn push immediately opens crucial diagonal lines and forces white to confront the unleashed central tension. Developing the bishop to an active square offers immediate counterplay against black's burgeoning kingside structure. Developing the bishop to this square fianchettos it, creating a powerful long-range diagonal influence and challenging white's central control. Solidifying the center with e3 offers flexibility, preparing development and preventing immediate pawn breaks while opening diagonals for the queen and bishop. Challenging the center immediately, black disrupts white's spatial ambitions and seeks active piece play. Capturing the pawn on c5 instantly resolves central tension, granting white a slight space advantage while opening the d-file for potential future pressure. This aggressive pawn grab bypasses the thematic king's Indian pawn structure that black was aiming for, forcing a more open game. Asserting pressure on the queen side immediately, this placement of the queen aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially fork pieces if white isn't careful, showcasing a bold initiative despite the pawn deficit. Bolstering the d4 pawn and preparing to contest the central files, this rook repositions defensively to protect against potential queenside infiltration while subtly hinting at future operations along the c-file, aiming to disrupt black's currently solid but somewhat passive pawn structure. Suddenly injecting a knight into the center creates a dynamic pawn structure and immediate pressure on white's queen and king's flank development, potentially forcing concessions. Opening the c-file for rook activity, white reclaims the pawn and aims to develop attacking pressure along the semi-open file, while subtly restricting black's knight's influence. Shattering the central pawn chain and disrupting white's knight coordination, this exchange aims to seize initiative and exploit the misplaced queen. Focusing on the central pawn tension, white's queen now eyes the queenside, preparing to contest the semi-open c-file and potentially pressure black's underdeveloped pieces, while also offering a shield for the king should the action move that way. Snatching that pawn, while seemingly tempting, creates an immediate tactical imbalance, pulling your queen out of its natural development and exposing it to potential harassment, which could lead to a loss of tempo and an awkward position to recover from. Opening the b-file for your rook now exerts immediate pressure on black's exposed queen and potentially forces them to concede further material or positional advantages, disrupting their attacking ambitions. Demanding the queen exchange now, black initiates a simplified battle, aiming to exploit the king's immediate safety after white recaptures the important queen. This maneuver strategically trades material, potentially opening lines for black's pieces as the queens vacate the center and creating a simpler, more tactical endgame scenario where piece activity becomes paramount. Unlocking the central files now presents white's king with significant exposure, forcing a defensive posture reminiscent of early middle game skirmishes rather than a smooth transition into the endgame. A knight finding a home in the center, poised to exert pressure and potentially fork pieces if white isn't careful. A bold assertion of central control is made, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially expose the king's safety later on. Securing the king amidst the swirling complexities of the center is paramount, and this castling maneuver deftly achieves that safety net, preparing the knight on d7 for its onward journey into the tactical skirmishes ahead. Striking a pawn is a bold decision, especially considering the resulting shattered kingside pawn structure for black. White surrenders the bishop pair, hoping to exploit the weakened squares around the black king and perhaps create future attacking opportunities on the open c-file, while simultaneously opening up lines for his own rooks. This exchange, though seemingly simple, fundamentally alters the positional landscape, shifting the game towards a more dynamic and potentially tactical struggle where precise piece play will be paramount. Black must now carefully assess the long-term consequences of this pawn damage and ensure his king remains well defended amidst the ensuing complications. Recapturing with the bishop reestablishes material equality and tidies up Black's kingside pawn structure, though it concedes the bishop pair and opens a diagonal for White's remaining pieces. This exchange often simplifies into an endgame where White might have a slight advantage due to pawn structure, but Black's active pieces can compensate for the lack of the bishop pair. The immediate focus shifts to controlling the central squares and preparing for a potential middle game maneuvering battle. This pawn push aims to seize central space and unlock the queen's bishop, creating potential attacking avenues for White's remaining pieces on the kingside. Unleashing a pawn thrust, Black aims to disrupt White's comfortable central presence and create immediate counterplay on the kingside. This aggressive pawn advance injects dynamic tension into the position, potentially opening lines for Black's pieces and forcing White to react defensively. It's a bold attempt to seize the initiative, daring White to misstep under pressure as the pawn storm begins to gather momentum. Pushing the e-pawn now asserts dominion over the center, creating a formidable outpost for the knight and subtly restricting Black's queenside play. This pawn advance dramatically alters the pawn structure, potentially leading to a long-term spatial advantage for White as Black's dark-squared bishop might find its diagonals severely hampered. Observe how this seemingly simple pawn thrust initiates a chain reaction, reshaping the battlefield and hinting at White's aggressive intentions in the upcoming middle game. It's a proactive step aimed at seizing the initiative and dictating the flow of the game. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing to challenge White's advanced e-pawn, this move fundamentally shifts the immediate conflict towards the kingside, seeking to unlock counterplay that was previously stifled by the locked central pawns and the e-pawn's dominion. Opening up the c-file now allows White to exert pressure on Black's queenside pawns, particularly if the bishop on d7 can be dislodged. This aggressive pawn advance aims to gain a foothold in enemy territory and potentially restrict Black's piece mobility, especially if the pawn can advance further to c5. Black firmly grasps the initiative by securing the open c-file, immediately challenging White's central pawn structure and setting the stage for active piece play. Opening the c-file decisively, White aims to exploit the pawn's advanced position to disrupt Black's queenside harmony and potentially launch an attack on the soon-to-be weakened light squares. Striking back against the central pawn chain, this captures creates immediate material equality but crucially opens the c-file for the rook, promising significant offensive potential on that open pathway. Unleashing the pawn chain's power, this advance creates significant spatial pressure, forcing Black into a reactive posture and potentially opening lines for White's pieces. This pawn push boldly claims crucial central space, opening lines for your pieces while simultaneously creating a formidable barrier that limits White's development and strategic options, a masterstroke in territorial acquisition. Initiating a kingside pawn storm with this advance signals White's intention to exploit the pawn mass and potentially create a passed pawn or launch an attack against the Black monarch, though it simultaneously weakens the light squares around the king itself, creating a delicate balance of positional trade-offs. Solidifying the pawn chain's forward momentum at the expense of creating a potential target on the kingside. This move establishes a defensive wall, but invites increased pressure down the central files and opens up avenues for White's pieces to infiltrate the kingside should Black fail to adequately shore up the defense. Injecting a knight into the fray on the kingside, this maneuver aims to exploit the now open h-file and potentially disrupt Black's developing pieces, although it leaves the knight somewhat exposed on the edge of the board. Black seizes the initiative by developing a pawn to the queenside, aiming to disrupt White's central pawn chain and potentially open lines for their rooks. This aggressive pawn push contests the advance of White's king's side pawns and signals a desire to create counterplay. Reinforcing the central pawn chain, this move sacrifices immediate development potential for a more robust pawn structure, aiming to restrict Black's piece activity and potentially prepare a kingside pawn storm later on. Unleashing a pawn storm with this advance aims to disrupt white's structure and create active play on the queen side, leveraging the passed pawn's potential. Preparing to launch a central pawn thrust, white aims to exploit the now open e-file and potentially activate the rook. The advance of this pawn heralds a fierce battle for control of the queen side, as black aims to secure a deep outpost for their rook, potentially cramping white's coordination and creating future attacking opportunities down the now opened file. The knight's repositioning to f2 initiates a subtle but significant shift, aiming to unburden the kingside and prepare a more active deployment. This knight might be destined for g4 to add pressure on the weakened dark squares, or potentially reroute through e4 to influence the d6 pawn and central space. It elegantly sidesteps the immediate threats on the h-file and allows white to explore more ambitious central pawn breaks or a more robust kingside defense. The pawn's audacious advance, aiming to snag a piece, injects a thrilling element of surprise into this tense positional struggle. Steering the knight towards the queen side, a strategic repositioning to exert pressure on the advanced pawn and potentially support a kingside pawn push later on, while also preparing for the inevitable endgame after such a pawn storm. Unleashing the rook to threaten the unprotected pawn on c6, this aggressive maneuver aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create immediate tactical opportunities by opening the file for further infiltration. The rook's repositioning here secures the open file, creating a vital corridor for white's remaining rook to penetrate and influence the queenside, while simultaneously preventing black's advanced pawn from becoming an unstoppable force. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, black seeks to create a diversion and potentially open lines for their pieces. But this aggressive pawn push might overextend the kingside pawns without sufficient piece support. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside creates immediate dynamic imbalances, forcing black to confront an aggressive pawn thrust that threatens to pry open crucial lines toward the royal family. A vital pawn sacrifice to crack open the kingside, finally creating some dynamism after a rather static phase where white's central control was becoming oppressive. Sensing an opportunity to shatter black's defensive shell, this capture opens up the g-file for potential assault, creating immediate pressure on the weakened king's flank while simultaneously gaining material advantage. Focusing on the king's precarious situation, this move desperately attempts to create a safe haven for the monarch by maneuvering it away from the open central files and towards the relative safety of the kingside, a clear indication of prioritizing defensive maneuvers over immediate counterplay. The bishop's repositioning to f4 aims to bolster the kingside pawn push and survey the central squares, potentially preparing for a later advance or pinning down key enemy pieces. Unleashing the rook on the open b-file injects immediate dynamism, aiming to exploit the pawn majority on the queen side and disrupt white's coordination by forcing the light-squared bishop back into a less active role. Pressuring the now exposed kingside pawn structure with the rook's entry onto the c-file intensifies the positional squeeze, aiming to restrict black's maneuvering options and prepare for potential advances. Unleashing the bishop's influence down the newly opened diagonal. Unlocking the c-file opens a dynamic new channel for white's rook to participate in the battle, potentially creating attacking opportunities against black's vulnerable queenside. Reconnecting the rook to its defending duties along the third rank, this maneuver simultaneously prepares to contest the open c-file, a crucial battleground for both sides. By bringing the rook back into play, black aims to disrupt white's established pawn chain and challenge any further advances. Shifting the rook to the second rank cleverly prepares to support the c-pawn's advance, aiming to exploit the open files and create potential threats against black's vulnerable king position should the central pawn structure dissolve. Unleashing the rook into the enemy's primary defensive line offers a sharp challenge, aiming to pry open avenues towards the weakened white king. Rerouting the knight from the wing to the center signals a shift towards consolidating white's queenside advantage and preparing a potential breakthrough.